With version 1.4 dropping soon, it is certainly looking like a stacked update featuring the highly anticipated Miyabi and Harumasa. But the possibility of rerun banners also dropping beside them is very likely, considering other Hoyoverse games such as Genshin and HonkaiStarRail dropped their first rerun banners in version 1.4. So with that in mind, the characters that would return in 1.4 would be our version 1.0 characters Ellen and Zhu Yuan. Though given the exact order following Genshin and HonkaiStarRail, it should definitely be Ellen dropping in 1.4 and Changli will be dropping in the following version as the next rerun banner. However, since we have no real confirmation on whether it will be Ellen, along with the fact there already is a broken ice DPS character dropping in 1.4, it could very much well be Zhu Yuan instead returning. So due to that, I'll just be going over some kit standouts for both Ellen and Zhu Yuan, how well they have aged since version 1.0, the value of the W engines, and ultimately, whether it's worth pulling for either Zhu Yuan or Ellen on their rerun banners. Just before we jump into it, as always, would really appreciate it if you could subscribe to the channel for more ZenlessZoneZero content and drop a like if you enjoyed the video. Now I'm gonna kick this off with our very first limited character in Zenless, Ellen Jo, which as we already know is an ice type attacker that pretty much carried many players at the beginning of the game. Specifically with Ellen's kit, the fact that her first core passive is not only able to boost the crit damage of her dash attack and charged basic attack by 100%, but is also able to provide up to 14% crit rate does provide a massive boost to Ellen's value, considering the main focus of traditional DPS characters is to maximize the amount of crit rate and crit damage they hold so that you can tap into their high damage dealing potential. So especially at the beginning of the game where players wouldn't have the best disc drives to provide to Ellen, it just made it much more easier to reach those desired crit thresholds, and even now, it is an extremely valuable core passive within Ellen's kit that pairs well with her high damage output. In addition, Ellen has great mobility as she is able to sprint much quicker than other characters whilst in a roaming state, which will definitely allow you to close the gap between you and enemies quicker and to reposition yourself much more efficiently. Of course, even out of combat having to run over to the next stage, it is pretty nice to be able to enter the roaming state as you can traverse insanely quick, allowing Ellen to be quite fun to play with along with being a great damage dealer overall. Now in terms of how well Ellen has aged since her release, given every version update since 1.0 has dropped an anomaly character which continue to be stronger and even more valuable than the last, at this stage it is certainly more difficult to use Ellen due to the very difficult competition she faces, especially with how much more DPS anomaly characters are casually able to deal over attack type characters. So unlike the anomaly meta continuously growing, attackers haven't really received much support to help them compete with the levels of DPS anomaly characters are capable of dealing. Though when lighter drops, that might possibly change as he will be able to buff ice damage for Ellen and shred ice resistance on enemies. But we will have to wait till he drops to see if his full kit can provide enough support to slightly close the gap between Ellen and anomaly DPS characters. That being said, Ellen still is able to deal a good enough DPS to clear through majority of content and still is part of one of the best teams in the game, being the Mono Ice team. Additionally, the fact that Ellen is still our only ice DPS character in the game allows her to hold quite a bit of value, as if there is any content that's in favor of the ice element, it means Ellen will be one of the best characters to clear that content. Of course, that being said, Miyabi is dropping in version 1.4 and her element is rumored to be a unique variation of ice known as Frost. So Miyabi will most definitely replace Ellen as the best ice DPS in the game. But due to the fact that Miyabi isn't an attacker, Ellen wouldn't be completely replaced as they would play completely different to each other. So until a new S-rank ice type attacker drops, Ellen still holds quite a bit of value with solid damage dealing capabilities, a fun playstyle, and being relatively easier to build than other DPS characters. Now as for the other potential rerun character, Zhu Yuan, I do believe she does hold more value than Ellen due to a few factors, but mainly since Zhu Yuan is one of the only two ether characters in the entire game. Also, considering there's quite a few stages in endgame where ether is a favored element, Zhu Yuan will then be one of or the best character in those specific stages. Additionally, just like Ellen's core passive being extremely valuable, so are Zhu Yuan's core passives, as with her first core passive, the damage from Zhu Yuan's enhanced shot shells is increased by a massive 40%. but when attacking stun enemies they are further increased by another 40%, bringing the total damage increase of one of Zhu Yuan's more valuable abilities to 80%. Also, along with the massive damage increase to the enhanced shot shells, Zhu Yuan unconditionally receives up to 28.8% crit damage, which will of course allow for building Zhu Yuan's disc drive sets to be much more easier than usual, just like with Ellen. However, as for Zhu Yuan's second core passive, she receives yet another crit boost, being a massive 30% crit rate boost for 10 seconds after using an EX special attack, chain attack or ultimate. So considering there are quite a few ways to activate this core passive, Zhu Yuan for majority of her time on field will have access to a massive increase in crit rate, allowing for there to be even less pressure on building her disc drive sets. So as for DPS characters, Zhu Yuan is probably the easiest one to build due to the various self-crit buffs she acquires through her own kit. Lastly, as for Zhu Yuan's playstyle, due to having the ability to deal both melee and range damage, it definitely allows Zhu Yuan to be one of the more comfortable characters to play with, since you can keep a gap between you and the enemy, which reduces the chances of you being caught up in something unexpected. So that paired with Zhu Yuan's incredibly high burst damage dealing potential, it does allow her to still be a solid DPS able to clear majority of content. Now as for how well Zhu Yuan has aged within the meta, as I mentioned, she is one of the only 2 ether characters in the entire game and is the only ether DPS. So with that alone, and due to no future characters looking to be part of the ether element from what we can currently see, Zhu Yuan will then hold quite a bit of value since she will be a great character to utilize in ether dedicated stages in endgame. Additionally, since Zhu Yuan's best team consists of Changli, which is the best stun character in the game, and Nicole, which is one of the best supports in the game, Zhu Yuan essentially has an immense amount of support that allows her to be a viable choice in endgame, as both Changli and Nicole are able to significantly boost Zhu Yuan's DPS. Of course, when compared to a disorder team consisting of Yanagi and Bernice or even Jane and Bernice, Zhu Yuan's DPS does still fall short, but it's at a level to allow Zhu Yuan to not face much difficulty in majority of content. Though similar to Ellen, there hasn't been any dedicated supports for attackers as the focus has been mostly on anomaly characters, so it is definitely becoming more difficult for Zhu Yuan to keep up with the anomaly meta. But that is until some sort of support does release later on, which will be able to massively boost the performance of attackers. Till then, Zhu Yuan is still a great DPS character that feels incredibly smooth to play with due to her mobility around enemies, is capable of dealing quite a lot of burst damage, and above all, is extremely easy to build in comparison to other DPS characters due to requiring much less investment. Now in regard to the signature W engines, Ellen specifically holds an incredible amount of value over any other alternative. Considering the main stat provides 24% crit rate, and as for the passive, Ellen unconditionally receives 25% ice damage bonus, along with when landing a basic attack, Ellen's crit rate is increased by 10% and is further increased by another 10% when dealing ice damage with a dash attack. So in total, Ellen will be able to receive 44% crit rate from her signature W engine, which really does make building her disc drives a complete joke, as they will require much less crit rate than usual, and so you would then be able to focus on maximizing her DPS with more crit damage rolls. So in comparison to the best alternative being the Brimstone, there would be a significant loss in DPS, and even more specifically in her burst window. So with that, to prolong Ellen's long-term usability as much as possible, you would definitely want to pick up a signature W engine, as it will provide her with a massive boost in performance. Additionally, since the passive isn't really specific, it is then definitely a great W engine for future ice type attackers, which means the W engine itself does hold quite a bit of long-term value. Of course, better W engines may release that are dedicated for future ice type attackers, but Ellen's signature is guaranteed to be amazing for herself and a great alternative for any ice type attacker in the future. Now as for Zhu Yuan's signature W engine, and unlike Ellen's, it really isn't as powerful and isn't completely necessary for Zhu Yuan. The main stat does provide 48% crit damage and the passive provides 15% crit rate along with receiving an increase in skill damage by 35%. Now as great as the boost in crit damage and crit rate will be for Zhu Yuan, if your crit stats are already at a pretty good level, then Zhu Yuan's alternatives consisting of the Brimstone and R5 Starlight engine aren't that far off in terms of performance. So due to that, Zhu Yuan's signature W engine just isn't as impactful as when compared to Ellen's signature W engine, which means you can comfortably skip and does in fact allow Zhu Yuan to be more free-to-play friendly, since you are capable of dealing similar numbers to a signature W engine with a 4-star W engine. So overall, since W engines aren't guaranteed, Zhu Yuan's signature W engine just doesn't hold enough value to warrant pulling for. But that being said, it is still her best W engine, and if you really like the character, then pulling for the W engine is completely down to you. Now with everything considered between Ellen and Zhu Yuan, they are certainly still great DPS characters but are in a completely different state from where they were in version 1.0. Mainly due to the amount of DPS characters that have dropped and are able to deal significantly more damage, which has definitely knocked the both of them down a peg or two. However, between the two, I do believe Zhu Yuan does have more value overall, since she is more free-to-play friendly, deals more burst damage, has a much stronger main team, and as far as what we can tell, will be the only ether DPS character in the game for quite some time. Unlike with Ellen, there will be a much more powerful ice DPS dropping being Miyabi, which again will play much differently to Ellen but as an ice DPS will be much more superior. Additionally, since Ellen does require her W engine more than Zhu Yuan does, it does mean she will be a bit more expensive to manage, whereas Zhu Yuan can comfortably use a 4-star Starlight engine to get by and deal great levels of DPS. So with that, Zhu Yuan seems to have more value overall between the two and will be a better character to pick up if she does drop as a rerun banner in 1.4. Though in comparison to the current meta, I do believe limited characters are progressing at such a rapid pace that it's definitely reducing the value of returning characters significantly, as there really isn't a point to pull for rerun DPS characters such as Ellen and Zhu Yuan unless you really like them, as there are characters such as Yanagi and Jiyan that completely obliterate content, and I do expect Miyabi and Harumasa to be even more powerful. So ideally, it would be better to summon for a more recent character if you are looking for performance, especially within 1.4 where Miyabi is going to be dropping, and on that note, rerun banners in Zenless may actually alter from their usual debut version since Miyabi again is dropping in version 1.4. Which means either Ellen or Zhu Yuan will likely make hardly any sales. So rerun banners could very well be pushed to 1.5, but regardless, they still don't hold as much value in comparison to more recent characters, and so you should only pull for them if you really like the character. And with that, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Would really appreciate it if you could subscribe to the channel for more ZenlessZoneZero content, and if you enjoyed the video, drop a like. Also drop a comment down below on who do you believe the first rerun character will be and whether you will be summoning or skipping. And yeah, hope to catch you guys later.